Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Bia Lacombe. Shama won't be here this week. As she announced last week, Shama is working on a book and will have to miss some episodes of our show. I'm really excited to announce one of our new co-hosts, Emily MacArthur. Emily is an organizer with Workers Strike Back, who you may know from previous episodes of On Strike.
I'm super excited to be here. Today, we'll be doing the second part in our series on the US-China Cold War. In January, we spoke with Tom Crean of US Socialist Alternative about the Cold War. Today, we'll be talking with Chang, a socialist organizer from China and an editor of the dissident website chinaworker.info. At this point, most of you have probably seen headlines about Biden and US imperialism coming into increasing conflict with Chinese imperialism. Headlines about things like US sanctions on the Chinese economy, US companies moving factories from China to friendlier nations or directly to US soil. Or speeches, like the recent State of the Union, where Biden talked about China's unfair economic practices and about standing up to Beijing.
And we're standing up against China's unfair economic practices.
Trump, with his right-wing populist approach, alternates between saying he'll be the toughest on China to make America great again.
Instead of hunting down Republicans, a reformed FBI and Justice Department will be hunting down Chinese spies.
To heaping praise on autocratic Chinese leader Xi Jinping. Of course, the US corporate media would never say imperialism to describe the role the US plays in global politics, but it's an accurate term to describe what's happening, both in terms of China and the US. Imperialist nations use their economic power and military power, or threat of military power, to enforce the interests of their respective ruling classes around the world. The underlying processes that drive imperialism forward are built into the foundations of capitalism. The drive for ever-expanding profits leads beyond the borders of a given capitalist country once it reaches a certain stage of development. Today, the US and China are both very powerful regimes competing for domination of resources and influence in the global economy, which is increasingly stagnant due to the inability of capitalism to drive innovation. This kind of conflict is not a temporary historical aberration, but rather the norm of capitalism, a norm that is reasserting itself as the era of neoliberal globalization with the US as an uncontested superpower has come to an end. If you saw our episode at the beginning of the year about the new Cold War and its importance in today's global situation, you have a great starting point for today's episode. If you haven't seen it yet, we definitely encourage you to go back and watch it. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 fast-forwarded these processes. As the first hot war of the new Cold War era, the Ukraine war represents a crucial test for the left. Neither imperialist camp waging the war has the interest of the working class in Ukraine, Russia, or anywhere at heart. This conflict is likely the first of more to come, with further devastating proxy wars springing up across the globe. A war between the US and China over Taiwan, which US military brass have openly acknowledged they're preparing for, would threaten even greater horrors. Socialists and the left must take an independent position based on the interest of the international working class, because neither Chinese nor US imperialism represents the interest of working class people in any country, nor does it offer any solution to these problems. Before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement and that On Strike can continue to bring you coverage of a wide range of issues from a working class perspective you won't find on mainstream media. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people.
We don't have a crystal ball. We are not in the business of predicting where struggle will break out, but wherever the struggle of the rank and file under capitalism breaks out, we need to be there. We need to help them get organized. So no matter what political issue inspires you or excites you, Workers Strike Back is for you.
Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member.
An important note for our viewers. Political organizing in China faces extreme censorship and repression. Part of what made the A4 protests in China in 2022 so remarkable was how they came out in defiance of this repression, but also how they were shaped by it. The signature of the protests and where they got their name was the blank piece of printer paper carried by protesters. This allowed an expression of anger without protesters publicly criticizing the CCP regime. Union organizers, student activists, and even political rivals within the CCP are routinely disappeared. As we go to air, Hong Kong just passed a sweeping national security law which Amnesty International characterizes as, quote, a crushing blow to human rights, end quote. So to protect the safety of our guest and the important activist work he and others are doing in China, we won't be showing video of him or referencing where he's currently living. Welcome, Chong, to the show today.
Hello, thanks for having me today.
Can you talk about the importance of the new Cold War and explain the escalating tensions between American imperialism and Chinese imperialism?
Yes, sure. The new Cold War marks an end of the neoliberal globalization of the past 40 years, and it represents a fundamental conflict between the two biggest imperialist powers in the world. This is not just about the policy of the global leaders, but it is driven by the deep crisis of the global capitalist system. And this means that it is not under the control of any capitalist leaders, and it has its own logic of development. In the past 40 years, basically the main capitalist countries in the world, they seek to cooperate with China, with the Chinese Communist Party regime, which is actually is a capitalist regime, to maximize the profit with a lot of foreign investment and economic ties and increase of the tradings. However, now more and more, especially for US imperialism, China become a threat of the status of the world's biggest imperialist power in the world. And US have changed from cooperating with China to have a strategy to not only suppress the economic growth or economic development, the power of China, but also geopolitically, they want to contain China and also to attack its system in order to maintain its main global, the world's first imperialist power status. And that's why in this situation, both imperialist power, because especially they are in very deep economic and political crisis, they do not have much room to maneuver or to compromise. And this means that this crisis, the new Cold War, is likely to escalate and spread to a wider sphere. Like, for example, now include technology, on economy, on military, but also on the global diplomatic ties. And for Xi Jinping dictatorship, if it faces a decisive defeat in this conflict, it will mean his ruling power will be threatened, which means the risk of the regime falling down. And that's why both imperialist power, they cannot afford to really show their weaknesses. And it even as at some point they do not particularly want to escalate the conflict, but because of this situation, the tension is likely to increase. And that's why this will cause a lot of change in global politics. For example, a lot of global issues, conflicts will be drawn on around the world will be drawn into the new Cold War. Just like the Ukrainian-Russian war is not an isolated war between two countries, but it is obviously US wants to use their attack to the Russian regime in order to demonstrate their power and also to have a practice their economic blockade, technological blockade against China to prepare for even bigger showdown in the future. And also we can see increasingly even like the war in Gaza, there's also an element that China and US, they are standing on each side. Although even Israel and China have a economic cooperation, but they in order to demonstrate their China's have the so-called status of the leader of the global South, to present themselves as a peacemaker. Increasingly, they want to demonstrate their support to Palestine superficially, not genuinely, just in order to counteract the US. This is what we can see. That's why the global issues or political issues become more and more complicated.
That was really excellent, and I think a really thorough explanation. One thing we're sort of realizing might be confusing for some U.S. viewers is, you characterized China as capitalist, whereas that's often not how it's depicted in the media. And I'm wondering if you could give just a brief explanation of why you use that characterization.
The Chinese government claim to be communist, but actually it is a capitalist power. Obviously, it's the anti-working class regime. Trade unions are banned in China. The working class are not allowed to organize any protests or to form unions, and they only have a official union, which is more like an extension of the state apparatus, which is used to attack workers during their protest or strike. And China has we have more billionaires than the US. The wealth gap in China is so extreme now, and so this is obviously showing that it is not anything linked to socialism or communism. The whole CCP regime is dominated by billionaires that they occupies their own sectors of business emperor, from electricity, oil, transport. Through the state, the power they get from the state, they own their own sectors of economy, which generates a huge amount of profit. And that's why many of these CCP high-level officials, they are found to have a huge amount of assets, especially say hidden overseas.
And I think, yeah, just the general chaos, right, that we see in the Chinese economy does not speak to a planned economy that we would expect to see in socialism that we would fight for and talk about. So going into the next question, what is the likelihood of direct military conflicts between the two sides in the near future? Why are Taiwan and the Western Pacific such a decisive aspect of the imperialist Cold War?
The situation now is very volatile. And even though we understand both US and China are trying to avoid a direct military conflict, because that will be too much cost for them economically and military. But the situation can be out of control of the main section of the ruling class. For example, in the US, the far right of the US Republican is pushing to change the fundamental policy to Taiwan of the past 40 years. And if the US really goes for like change the status of Taiwan, which means they support a formal declaration of Taiwan independence, or they openly put positioning the US troops in Taiwan, or for example, they sign a new US treaty with Taiwan, which is more formally saying they will protect Taiwan military in case of invasion from China. All this can cause a spiral effect. The development will be that because Xi Jinping will not be able to show the weakness and back down. That's why they will have to respond in a much more aggressive way. On the other hand, Xi Jinping regime is in a big crisis. It needs nationalism to divert the attention of the anger of mass people from China to the US. And increasingly, they use this the fear that China will go on war in the future in order to suppress any criticism or mass struggle in China. And this propaganda does have an effect, and it can also have the effect that it will in turn to put the regime under pressure, because in case of there is any conflict with the US, Xi Jinping has to respond in a more hardline way to show that they are really in a big tension in the US, and also to show that China will not back down. And this means that Xi Jinping has no much room to soften his position or to maneuver. And also, if China has a full control of Taiwan, this will mean that the US position of the global first power will be decisively weakened since the Second World War. This will also change the balance of force we can see now in Asia, for example, Japan, South Korea, India, Philippines. Now, basically, they are the allies of the US. But the balance of force can be changed that they will, if Taiwan has lots of control, they will have to rethink that if US is still really their main ally or the main power that can control. And so this will have a effect to change the whole balance of force in the Indo-Pacific region. And we can see now there are many small issues, it seems like smaller conflicts, like in Kinmen, which is an island of Taiwan that is geographically very close from China. There were two ships of China, the boat from China that was they were brought down, and this creates a conflict between China and Taiwan about that whether it was the Taiwan military involved in that or it was just an accident. And we can see that now this is an increasingly tension of this investigation, and it can cause also the more tension between China and Taiwan. And also there is more and more like tension between China and Philippines because of the change of the Philippine government to a more pro-US government, and that is shift away from the previous Duterte government, who was a bit more like trying to balance between China and US. Now there are more and more cancellation of the infrastructure projects investment agreements because Philippines increasingly try to shift away from China and turn towards the cooperation with, for example, Japan or India. So we can foresee that many of these now seems smaller issues that they are potentially can be very explosive or can be accumulate into a much bigger crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chong. I think just to expand a little bit, also for our viewers who might not know, just the economic significance of Taiwan in the current context. Taiwan now manufactures more than half of the chips globally that power, all the electronics and, from everything from cars to cell phones. And the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is the 9th most valuable business in the world. And so, as the BBC said, that makes Taiwan nearly irreplaceable and vulnerable. And so I think that it really highlights how these different powers jockeying for control over Taiwan, it puts into context why that's happening and why the US and China, neither of them can afford to cede control to the other. But a sweeping feature of Chinese and of global politics today is the state of the Chinese economy. The growth in the Chinese economy was credited with helping to address the Great Recession in 2008, 2011. Economists have been pointing out that this will not be a repeat occurrence in the next recession. Can you give us an overview of the crisis in the Chinese economy and how bad do you think it is?
Yes, the property crisis is a turning point, a decisive factor. This is a biggest decline of the economy since the restoration of capitalism in China after 1989. And the property crisis, we can see the turning point was in 2011 when the bankruptcy of Evergrande, which was the second largest property developer in China. And since then, the crisis has spread and continue to develop. And now more and more property developers, they are in a big financial problem, and which we can not rule out that there will be more and more company as a repeat of Evergrande. That there's such a large property developing companies that going to bankrupt. And even worse that the property crisis has a chance to spread into a banking system. we can see now also the banking system, like there's a shortage of the financial shortage, and also they have the problem because if the property companies, the property developers, cannot repay their loans to the bank, that's a situation that the banking crisis can also develop. And already we could have seen that there are many like middle-sized bank or their financial products being bailed out by the state for the over past 2-3 years. And now the economy of China is going down into the road of Japanification because we can see in the 1990s, after the burst of the of the property bubble in Japan, the economy went down into a long-term stagnant with no real growth, and also because of the huge debt that make the economy very difficult to rebound, and the long-term low consumption. This is now the very similar phenomenon happening in China, and this will have very big social implication because of the youth unemployment in China is very alarming now. There was the last year the figure was over 21% of the youth unemployment, but this figure is obviously underestimated because it is an official figure. There are scholars estimating that the real figure is like 46%. And since then, in August last year, the government even had to stop the announcement of this figure for a few months because it is too shocking and the regime thinks that it will create instability. So all these have the political implication because China is a dictatorship. In bourgeois democracy, the governments, they can change the governments or change the leaders in order to relieve the pressure from below. But under the dictatorship, the CCP will have to have full social control and also extremely repressive methods in order to continue their ruling. And they do not have the much room in order to maneuver or to relieve the anger of the mass people. And this means that the social anger can accumulate into a much very explosive, or even in the onto the revolution, the level on the revolutionary anger or crisis. And China doesn't is a in the reality it is the GDP per capita is still a third world it's like a third world economy. So the social insurance or the protective net of China is very, very weak. And a bigger economic crisis will means that much more the poverty level or the people which are affected, the working class affected will be living in a very seriously condition. And that's why it's linked to the development of the new Cold War because China needs to not only needs to politically they want to divert the anger to bring the social problems to the so-called the foreign forces, but also they need to have a geopolitical gain the geopolitical power in order to, for example, export their problem to other smaller countries, like what they do with trying to export their debt to other countries through their loanings to smaller countries for the infrastructure, building the infrastructure projects.
Right. So it seems pretty clear from the depth of that crisis that China is not in any kind of position to be the motor force to get the global economy out of another recession like it did in 2008, and that the unemployment crisis is likely to continue to haunt, the Chinese economy for sort of the prospective future. And, in terms of what is the path forward for the new Cold War, it seems pretty clear at this point that we are seeing a horrific repeat of Trump versus Biden in the US presidential elections in November. If Trump was to win the election, how do you think US foreign policy would change compared to under Biden?
Actually, the difference between the policy between Biden and Trump is not so big. the new Cold War will largely continue. Because both Trump and Biden, they are the representative of the capitalist class, which means that they are not able to solve any of economic problem. That's why the new Cold War, which is driven by this crisis, they will need to continue it to in order to maintain or to defend their interests in the global geopolitical politics. Of course, there will be difference in what the kind of policies they will do, but it's not likely that Trump will reverse the process of the development of the conflict with China. For example, we know Trump tends to have a more isolationist policy that will like to put more resources back into the economic development into US. That Trump will criticize Biden for putting too much resources, military budget, or give too much benefits to other countries in the economic or the trade deals. This means that Trump can wants to renegotiate some of these terms, uh, like the trading or the economic agreements with other countries. Also, that now we know that on the war in Ukraine, that Trump said that they want to cut the military aids to the Ukraine. It is likely that even they do so, that the war in Ukraine will not just they cannot just abandon it, because it has been such an important conflict for the US to gain their global position for the past 2 years. And at the same time, we know now Germany and France are planning to increase their military production, especially to prepare this situation. And for example, on Taiwan, the support, like the military cells or the technological support from the US to Taiwan, this is very unlikely Trump is elected, will change it. Of course, that will mean Trump's policy will mean that they will be a bit more unstable, unlike Biden, who tried to build a more comprehensive, more consistent system in Indo-Pacific region to contain China, like to strengthen the allies with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan to contain China. But Trump will not be seen as a very reliable ally by these countries. But at the same time, all these countries, their state has been like prepared for a situation the conflict is escalated. So they will continue to like escalate, to continue for their militarization policy, and to continue to use nationalism in order to point the direction of the conflict to China. So this means it can be more unstable, and the countries will do these different countries of the U.S. ally can do more their own thing, but it doesn't mean that the conflict will just change or stop. Yeah.
I really agree about, Biden and Trump. They just seem to be in a competition over who can be the most anti-China. And so, yeah, they're fundamentally not so different on their approach to China. One thing that illustrates this is that Trump's tariffs in 2019 on the Chinese economy, on Chinese exports, so taxes on goods that are sent from China and bought in the U.S. were pretty considered pretty wild at the time. There were a lot of commentators were really shocked that he did that. But then Biden hasn't rolled back those tariffs, has kept them in place, and so I think that we see that continuation of that policy. And that ultimately there are so many signs pointing towards continued escalation of military buildup and this continued use of nationalism, as you were saying, by both Biden and Trump. We've seen that certainly from Trump, and so that isn't something that would change. But in terms of the situation in China, there were courageous protests in 2022 by ordinary Chinese people against the brutal zero COVID policies of the Xi Jinping regime. Can you tell us what has happened to movements of working and young people in China since then? And also, why has the regime specifically been cracking down on young women?
First, we need to see in China, because it's the dictatorship, working class or any protest group are not allowed to organize. So that's why mass movement doesn't develop steadily or in a stable way. But usually they erupt, mass movement will erupt when there was a big social anger in a very explosive way. So the protests are usually not planned or not being followed through any trade unions or planned by any protest group. That's why the mass anger and the mood, anti-Xi mood is still in China, and they have been there are more and more internet debate in China, because in China many of the political issues they are being discussed online. Even there's a censorship. For example, the people use different kind of they develop different kind of invent different kind of new words, like they say now in China the workers are more like a human, which is like mine being extracted or being used and scrapped to describe their own life. There's also a phenomenon called lying flat, which means that the young people they do not want to go to work. They do not want to follow the traditional social norm that they need to go to university, graduate, and get a job, and then to buy a property and to set up a family, because they feel that this is just a process of being like a prison or being exploited. And that's why there's a phenomenon called lying flat, that young people want to maintain their more like a minimal lifestyle, that they do not want to go to work, they do not want to marry, because they will lose all the freedom. And this is a phenomenon being discussed online very much, and that's why this is a kind of more like a silent protest against the regime. So of course now there's a big disillusion after the zero COVID policy end, because there's no rebound of economy, and the youth will feels that this crisis is much deeper, and many people start to realize that the problem is fundamentally is from the central government or even from the capitalist system. There's an increased number of workers strike, because when the factory opens, there are much more workers dispute, like the non-paid wages or the unpaid social insurance, etc. And we cannot rule out there will be another like more explosion of a movement, like what happened in 2022. Even though there's a big crackdown in school or in universities, uh, and to put surveillance of the more prominent protesters in 2022, but this they cannot stop it. But it's likely to happen in a very abrupt way, unless the regime has a big crisis, that there's a situation of out of controls, and protest groups or workers unions are started to have a space to start to organize. And on the reason why there's a crackdown on young women, first, of course, young women has played very important role in the protests. Many of them were students or even teachers in universities in organizing initiate protests in universities in 2022. And so the CCP wants to show an example by arresting them in order to attack. But more behind that is more deeper political reason, because the feminist movement has becoming a big threat to the Chinese regime. Since 2018, there were waves of Me Too movement accusation of sexual harassment by young women, to point to their the boss or managers in workplace or university management authorities or some very rich tycoons. And the CCP see this as a very potentially explosive. And because this accusation, if it is in one case, it points to the vice premier in China by a woman ethnic. So this will damage the authority of the regime. And in China, the response is to say that this is the feminism is they need to ban this word, and they see this is a anti-China. They say this is from some Western influence, or it's an anti-China plot. And also, there's a big population crisis in China since 2022. The population has been shrinking, which is linked to the lying flat phenomena that I just described. Also, many young women, they feel that if they marry, they will lose their job opportunity or their personal freedom because they have to take care of child and to have play the role of the family. They need to bear all the responsibility in taking care of the family, and that's why they do not want to marry. Of course, it's also linked to the economic crisis, that the huge property, the housing cost, and the cost of having a child is so high. The CCP's response is not to, of course, they cannot and they will not try to solve these economic problems. Their response is that they think this is because of feminism or LGBT that is damaging the traditional family value. And so their response is to launch huge propaganda campaign, like they want to cultivate a new culture of marriage and childbearing. And also they want to attack feminist protesters to crush this shift of the increase of this feminist consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I think this last point that you made really underscores why the third demand for Worker Strike Back is the need to fight racism and sexism and all oppression, because we do see how these repressive governments sort of, no matter where they are, no matter sort of what their cultural background is, are leaning into racism, sexism, homophobia again and again to beat back struggle in the working class. And I think also just shows, right, that movements don't have borders, that they are inspired across the world. You described the lying flat struggle as a silent protest, which I think is a really good description because it connects it to this quiet quitting movement that we've seen all over the US. Yeah, just sort of, I think, really struck by just all this sort of parallel things as we're talking about the decay in both economies, just these parallels. And I think another one that stuck out to me while you were speaking was, we saw these historic protests in 2020 in the US, and that was coming out of the horrors of the mass deaths in the US due to COVID. And in some ways, it seems like the A4 protests, the zero COVID protests, were kind of a parallel struggle that came out of, just the real horror at the repression of the zero COVID policies of the CCP regime. So I think, your focus on this increase in strikes in China points to our next question, which is, what position do you think working people in China and in the United States should take in relation to the US-China divide? What role do we have? Is this Cold War in the interest of working people anywhere? And in your view, what is ultimately needed to bring these imperialist conflicts to an end?
We understand all the wars and conflicts are to a certain extent connected to the US-China conflict. And that's why there's a much more need for the global working class in China, in US, also in all other countries, to have a real solidarity, which means that they can collaborate together to stop these global conflicts, like the imperialist war or economic confrontation between the different big powers. This is just for the interest of the ruling class, and the working people will not have any benefit from that. Also, the huge push for the militarization. This is a waste of a lot of resources of the working people to in the expense of their like education or housing or social protection. All other resources are uh, being sacrificed for the military budget, and that's why there's a need for the global working class to collaborate to organize together for a like the war in Ukraine or in Gaza for anti-war protests and movements. Trade unions link up together in order to put pressure onto their government in order to stop all these confrontations. However, only by this is not enough because once capitalists are still in power, the war will still continue, or the war can still develop, and that's why the working class needs their own political parties, whether in China, in US, or in other countries, to defend their own interests and to struggle against the global imperialist powers. This is what our organization is trying to build to end these imperialist conflicts by a global working class struggle. We will not stand on either side of China or the US because this is not the interest of a one particular nationality, but it's a common interest of the all working class people around the world.
I couldn't agree more. I think speaking of worker strike back demands, our fifth demand, no more sellouts, we need a new party, specifically, stems from, in part, this analysis of the world situation and how both Biden and Trump and just the capitalist class in general are pushing us toward ever greater conflict and military buildup, and that we need a party that represents working class interests, and that it's not going to be voting for either Biden or Trump in November that's going to solve the US-China Cold War, and that we, like you're saying, is needed all around the world. You need a new party here in the US as well. It all comes back to the need for international working class struggle, and that's why we're socialists, and we think that we need a complete change from capitalism, that we need a socialist society to end these horrific wars. But before you go, we wanted to ask one question about climate change, because that's an increasing component of everything in the global situation, but increasingly dangerous for working people. Last summer, there were disastrous floods across China. The country also experienced an unprecedented heat wave the same year. And studies by climate scientists have concluded that climate change made the heat wave at least 50 times more likely. How did the Xi Jinping regime respond to these crises? And is there a way out of the climate catastrophe on the basis of global capitalism and imperialism?
The Chinese government basically they doesn't have any superior plan to eliminate the climate crisis. Obviously, these floodings and heat waves have created huge social anger and big question about the capability of the government to try to deal with this crisis. But the CCPs respond internally in the countries. Basically, they do not provide any real solution. Can be some misunderstandings more in the foreign propaganda because the CCP they try to project themselves to the foreign countries as they are a green country, or they are trying to invest a lot in renewable energy like the solar panel or the wind power. In China, 70% of the China's energy production is from fossil fuel, and they still build new power plant that is using coal. The coal plants they will build more. They are trying to build more because there was a shortage of electricity. There's a big propaganda among the pro CCP supporters saying that climate we do not bear the responsibility of the climate change because we are a backward country. And these are just all the problems from the West because they are the more advanced countries. We can see how they project themselves into the domestic audience and the foreign audience is very different. And also the they have been building a lot of like solar panel or windmill, but all these renewable energy infrastructures, most of them are not connected to the electric grid to supply the electricity. They only want to use the building of this infrastructure for investment, for driving the number of the economic growth. So we can see the production of the solar panels in China is enough to fill the global demand. But because they are not using it, they want to export these solar panels or solar power components to other countries. So the usage of the solar power only accounts for 4.7% of the energy production in China. And that's why we can see this propaganda. China is a green force. They do not have strong support on all this propaganda. And the crisis in China, the climate catastrophe, obviously there's no solution under global capitalism and imperialism. And also they will not be able to eliminate, for example, the fossil fuel, which is a big state sector of the economy. They are unable to eradicate it because of the big interests of the CCP officials and the tycoons.
I mean, it just really underscores what you were saying about how much solar panel production, for example, there is in China that can meet global demand, and just, other things we know about how we could make a rapid transition to green energy right now, today, if that was something that the capitalist system was interested in doing. But there are profits to be had in coal and in natural gas and in oil. And so just like we've seen also under Biden, a huge increase in drilling, and even though he claims to be the most climate-friendly president.
And unfortunately, groups like the Sunrise Movement and other environmentalist organizations have backed him up on that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, tons of climate organizations support him and support that him calling himself that, which is really shameful. But I think, it's clear that this won't be solved on the basis of capitalism, and that we do need, we need a system that will prioritize the needs of the planet and of humanity. Can't thank you enough, Chong, for joining us today. Thank you. This was a incredibly valuable conversation. So for our viewers, don't forget to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel. On Strike is a production of Workers Strike Back, a nationwide organization fighting on working class demands like a $25 an hour minimum wage, union jobs, Medicare for all, and against discrimination and oppression. Workers Strike Back is also calling for a new party for working people because neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party represents us. Find out more at workersstrikeback.org and donate. And look for us on Patreon to support our work. On Strike is a broadcast entirely for working people and funded entirely by working people. Solidarity.